Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Contra Mundum. We are here, CJ and I, we're here with Louis Betty and Ethan Rundell, the translators of Renaud Camus. Can we even say the title, CJ? Are we allowed to say it?
We can. Yeah, we talked about it last time. It's
yeah, I'm here.
well, we're gonna use
My
phrases
reception's
like
a little bit bad, but it should clear up in a moment, I think.
what is that?
Yes, Louis' reception's bad. He's in the backwoods of Wisconsin right now.
Yeah, but you can see
Yes,
the
I'm
title.
a public library. I have to be here because
We lost him. They attack us.
He'll be back.
Well, I'm worried about the algorithm and the title.
Well, but the title the titles themselves, I don't think contain anything objectionable.
Maybe but
in
France maybe.
But the
Exchange
algorithm,
one thing for another.
the algorithm goes through the audio. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Like the audio. Yeah.
There we go. We lost Louis. Let's bring him back. This is a great start. Okay, there he is.
I'm here. All right.
But welcome, gentlemen.
We'll see.
Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, Louis. Welcome, Ethan. Thank you for joining us. And in this book, I guess the first question I want to ask is why bring this French author to American or Anglophone audiences? Right? Why did you set out to do this? You guys have great academic careers. You could do anything you want. Why this?
Well, in my case, I do have a kind of fondness for what the French call écrivains maudits, or cursed authors, people who have been canceled, because I usually assume that they've been misrepresented, and it's almost always the case. So when I got wind of Camus, I thought, I've been through this before studying other authors like Michel Houellebecq. I'm sure that what's being claimed about him is at the very least an exaggeration. And it was much more than that. It's something that over the years has morphed or metastasized, you might say, into a willing slander against this man and his ideas. So that just at a personal level is in my interest as a scholar, that really draws me in. In terms of the meaning and the message, though, I think that he is the master thinker of the critique of the cultural consequences of mass migration in Europe. And I've read a lot of different people who talk about the same thing, but nobody does it as forcefully and consistently and really, frankly, convincingly as he does. So I'm someone who cares a lot about Europe. I come from a Southern family that has a very kind of Anglo sense about itself. So I grew up, with the idea that Europe was a place I was supposed to go, a place I was supposed to learn about. And having lived there and seen, the consequences of what he's talking about. I taught, I was in my 20s in a college or a junior high school, where you had this cohort of kids who were immigrants or immigrant descended, who were very obviously not concerned with being French, didn't really think of themselves as being French. And there were just some awful things that I observed. So I knew what he was talking about in a way that most people wouldn't. Even if they were, interested in Europe and receptive to his ideas. Ethan, anything?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say two things. I also lived in France. I lived in France for almost a decade. My daughter was born there. I worked there. I did research there. And I saw, I lived in the banlieue de Paris, outside of Paris, the famous banlieue, the suburbs. I lived inside Paris as well, in many different neighborhoods. So I have, I think, a pretty educated view of contemporary French social reality, and many of the things that Camus discusses with regards to that are patently obvious to me. And so in that sense, I think he's a very, very important chronicler of contemporary French life. The other thing I would add, however, is coming back to the States. Every few years, there would be people talk about the Great Replacement in the press, and this evil guy Renaud Camus, with whom I was already passingly familiar. And Louis and I agree that whatever else you think about Camus, whatever else you think about his work, it was deeply objectionable that there was so much discussion of this man, this text, this idea. And yet no one before we came along had dared or perhaps even thought of translating it and making it available in English. It seemed to us just at the most basic level an obligation of intellectual honesty to if we could bring this text and other texts like it out so that the public discussion could be better informed than it was. I don't think we've succeeded. We brought the text out. I don't think it's had much impact on the public discussion, but nevertheless, I think that was for both Louis and myself a central motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's break this down. I know you guys have done 3 books. Is that right? Is it 3?
Yeah,
we've done 4, but 3 Camus books.
Mm-hmm.
3. Oh, okay, 3 Camus books, and one of them is fiction. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and how do you pronounce that one?
Europe. The O, I think, is a Y sound in Danish.
Okay.
I believe it's Danish or some sort of.
It's Danish. Yeah, it's meant to be pronounced Europe, in fact.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's I like this little one because why don't we talk about this first kind of, and then we can put it to the side and we can talk about some of his more, the ideas that the media likes to latch onto a little bit. So, like what is he explaining here in this fiction book and how does it relate to, some of the more serious essays?
Ethan, you translated it. I didn't. Do you want to speak to it? It's probably closer to your mind.
Sure. It's so Camus in this book is offering essentially a parable of post-war Europe. The book begins. I'm not going to go into there's a fictional device. The fable is presented as a long lost tale by Hans Christian Andersen that is discovered in the aftermath of some terrible tragedy. Camus never tells us what the tragedy is, only that it happened, and in the aftermath, this tale was discovered. And the tale that he then proceeds to tell bears a striking resemblance to what we all know about the history of post-war Europe, World War II Europe, which is to say there was a world war, unprecedented violence, huge massacres of civilians, and that afterwards, in the decades that followed, a new sort of historical consciousness arose in Europe, according to which, whatever else the case, never again would the continent plunge itself into that kind of violence. It would do anything necessary to avoid finding itself once again confronted with a Second World War type situation. And in order to achieve this, it decided that it had to exit history. History was over once and for all. All the right decisions have been made. All the knowledge that was needed had been acquired. From now on, the future of the continent would simply be a matter of essentially economic considerations and openness to the other, and so on and so forth. And in this little fable, Camus then presents the consequences of this way of thinking, of having exited history. And I think it's a very interesting discussion, in part because it's much less polemical than his other writings that we've translated, and yet many of the central themes of his thought are present in it. The Great Replacement, of course, but also the Little Replacement, the shift from a high culture to petite bourgeois culture, the results of egalitarianism in education and in family life and in other fields. So I don't know. Is that a fair summary, Louis?
No, I think that's a brilliant summary. Yeah.
I mean, we published it because we thought it would be a really good entry point to Camus' thought. It's a very short little book. We priced it to sell, and we thought that people who might not be ready to dive headlong into his essays, nevertheless might profit from reading it and decide after reading it that they want to discover more about it.
Andrew, have you read this one?
I have not read this one. No.
No. Okay.
Now I want to.
Yeah.
I mean, if I could, just briefly, I'm not going to read a million quotes this time. Since we're talking about Europe, I did actually set down a quote from the book because it occurred to me in the context of the hurricane. As I mentioned beforehand, I live in Western North Carolina, so all that's happening around me. People have been reporting on the inadequacy of the federal government's response to the disaster in Western North Carolina. And I thought that there was a really good passage in this book you wrote that touches upon it. So with your permission, I'll read it.
Of course.
Okay?
Yes.
One would have also sworn that this empire had no people of its own, for, with great thrusts of their chins, its chosen leaders declared a population policy to better ensure that the incessant flood tide of newcomers be more evenly spread across the full extent of the imperial territory, with no nook or cranny spared, no matter how remote. But we're already here, the natives might have said. See us, remember that we exist too. And yet they said nothing at all, knowing only too well that their masters did not love them and planned to replace them with other peoples, whom these authorities, rightly or wrongly, considered more docile, more closely bound to them because indebted to them for everything, more consonant with philosophical fashion, and fashion tout court, and less expensive. And that came to mind precisely in regards to the FEMA response to the disaster, because as we know, the federal government has been handing out prepaid cards to illegal immigrants in the amount of $2,500, and yet have just announced that for hurricane survivors, there are only $750 available.
Yeah.
So
it's really shocking. Like, it's almost unbelievable. Like if this event was to happen and we were predicting it, and like we said, well, if this ever happened to Americans, they wouldn't get very much compared to Ukraine or the Haitians or any other, whatever project, the federal government wants to do. People would think we were nuts and we were engaging in right-wing conspiracy. And then this thing happens, and literally you could not have predicted a scenario like this. You get chump change. You lost your house, you lost your memories, you lost your family, you lost everything that gave meaning to you, and you get $700. Like, that's
not only do you only get $750, but you have to wait several days before anyone even attempts to determine whether you're alive or to supply you with food or water. And again, Camus I find the relevance of Camus' writings increased by the day. So in this connection, again, there's another term that he uses regularly. In French, it's la préférence occupante, which means preference for the occupier, which refers to the government policy that take as their prime directive to always, first and foremost, favor the newly established population, legal or otherwise, at the expense, most often, of the native population. And in the case of the FEMA response to the hurricane in Western North Carolina, I mean, that there couldn't be a clearer illustration.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a great little book, and is it like 30 pages? It's really tiny.
It's only 36 pages long.
Yeah. So I highly recommend. Like, by the time we're done with this conversation, you're going to be filling your carts up with Camus books. So put that one in there now.
Do.
And we'll go to the next one.
I just wanted to add that Louis he texted me. He'll be rejoining us in a moment. He's going to a sure location for internet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
No problem. So, okay. Well, this is perfect that we started with this book then. Let me just ask one more. Well, first of all, was this the first book that you translated, or the third?
Of Camus?
Yes.
No. We started with Enemy of the Disaster.
Okay.
That's the anthology. Louis wrote the introduction for that. And that contains, I think, some of Camus' best known texts.
Okay, so but this parable was basically just a fabulized version of his actual serious contemplation. So this is something that you can get a digest of his work, but it's in a fictional format.
That's right, and to that extent, it's, I think, much more accessible. Everyone I've given it to, I gave it to my oldest daughter, I gave it to my wife, I gave it to some friends. Everyone who's read it, whatever their sort of intellectual interests or their reading habits, they've all reported that they were not just consumed by its reading it. They read it straight through. It's short, but also moved by it. And so we were hoping that this book would be a big success. We make essentially no money on its sale. I mean, we're selling it for cost, just because we wanted to get it out there. And so far we haven't had much success, but Perhaps that will
Soon.
change. Yes.
Yeah. You get the Contramundum bump.
Yeah. I hope you do. So until Louis comes back, you're the guy. So let me just move on then. Let's talk about the Wikipedia page, because I know that's something that's on your mind constantly. Everyone knows that Wikipedia is basically like it exists to basically create consensus and to prevent other opinions from coming in. They're basically like a big hall monitor, and that's how they exist. So describe some of the fights that you've had to engage with Wikipedia on Camus.
Sure. So when Enemy of the Disaster came out, and right before it came out, we were, as publishers will be, we approached various journalists who we thought would be sympathetic to the title and interested in it, and many of them were. And we sent out quite a few review copies, and Louis and I both heard back from a number of these figures telling us how deeply impressed they were by the book. Used terms like dynamite or amazing. Some of them, promised that they would talk about it at one point or another. Others didn't, but nevertheless were enthusiastic. And this is in the United States. And then months passed, and we really didn't have anything. There were no reviews. There still has been no sort of mainstream press review, even conservative mainstream press review of any of our books in the United States. In Great Britain, by contrast, some brave journalists have done so, and that's to their credit. And some people on Substack and elsewhere have mentioned us here. And my suspicion was the reason that we weren't getting the reception that we expected. And again, this isn't about making money. It's about the purposes of our project, which we discussed at the very beginning of this. The reason we weren't getting the reception that we wanted, I became convinced, was essentially the Wikipedia page. If you look at the Wikipedia page, I just checked it out today. I wrote down the first 2 paragraphs, and I could read them. You see it, and it's pretty strong beer. I mean, any journalist who's going to review any of our books, I think, is self-consciously taking a risk. They're exposing themselves to anyone who may want to take advantage of this, of charges of racism, of white supremacy, of enabling white supremacist terror, of anti-Semitism, all kinds of stuff. And so they may have really liked the book, but on the other hand, they probably like having careers. And so they haven't done anything. So it became apparent to me that, if we hope to get reviews, at some point, either some very enterprising and courageous journalists would have to be willing to take the risk, or alternately, somehow Wikipedia would have to be convinced to change their entry. So I began engaging with Wikipedia. I don't know if you want me to go into all the details, but essentially what I did is I started with the first paragraph or 2, which are chock of Camus' Wikipedia entry, which are chock full of either lies or half-truths.
You should read it.
Or distortions. Yeah, I'll read the first 2 paragraphs.
Yeah.
Renaud Camus, a French novelist, conspiracy theorist, and white nationalist writer. He's the inventor of the Great Replacement. That's true. A far-right conspiracy theory that claims that a global elite is colluding against the white population of Europe to replace them with non-European peoples. That's paragraph 1. Paragraph 2. Camus' Great Replacement has been translated on far-right websites and adopted by far-right groups to reinforce the white genocide conspiracy theory. Camus has repeatedly condemned and publicly disavowed violent acts which have been perpetrated by far-right terrorists stemming from his theories. So let's say you want to give this book a good review. Anyone?
I'm back.
I'm just doing the Wikipedia thing quickly.
Okay.
Anyhow, just quickly to say the problems here. Camus, he wrote a few novels. He's written over 150 books. A handful have been novels, primarily characterizing him as a novelist. Seems to me not to be the most accurate characterization. He's called a conspiracy theorist. We can go into this later. He's not a conspiracy theorist. The Great Replacement is explicitly not a conspiracy theory. Nothing in his texts or writings justifies that claim. He's a white nationalist writer. He's not a white nationalist writer. Nowhere does he claim that nation is predicated upon race, much less, or even specifically in the European case, that the Great Replacement is a far-right conspiracy theory. Well, it's not a conspiracy theory. It certainly can't be a far-right conspiracy theory in this case. That there's a global elite colluding against the white population. Renaud Camus, to my knowledge, has never, and in the Wikipedia entry, global elite is put in quotation marks, as if they don't want to say that, but that's what Renaud Camus says.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, nowhere in his writing has Renaud Camus ever employed the expression global elite. So it's curious.
And they don't require a citation for those quotation marks.
No.
Yeah.
And then he's been translating on far right websites. Okay, maybe. I don't know. We're his translators. We're his publishers. I've never seen any of this stuff. What websites are those? They don't tell you. And adopted by far right groups. Okay, perhaps. But who are those groups? They don't tell us this either. And then finally, and this might be the most slanderous part of the passage, Camus repeatedly condemned and publicly disavowed violent acts which have been perpetrated by far-right terrorists stemming from his theories. Perpetrated by far-right terrorists stemming from his theories. So this is almost explicitly asserting that Camus' writings have caused far-right violence. And yet, until last year, none of Camus' writings, to our knowledge, except for perhaps some vague samizdat things, have existed in translation. So if anyone was going to read Camus, they would have had to know French, and really well. And I don't think any of the people that this entry is referring to were scholars of contemporary France or the French language. And if they had read Camus in the original French or in some crap English translation, they would have discovered that Camus is not at all the man he's presented to be. He does not advocate violence. He is not an anti-Semite. He does not believe in a conspiracy. So if they were to have read Camus, they would have been discouraged from their activity rather than encouraged. Yeah. So those two paragraphs alone are profoundly dishonest and tendentious. And so I engaged with Wikipedia to try to get them to change some of the terms. It's starting with just simply acknowledging that Camus now exists in translation, that we've brought out Camus in English. They refused. And so I harassed them. I was in the talk page, objecting to things and presenting evidence and citing some of the reviews we got in the British press. And they ignored me. And yet yesterday, finally, somebody had read one of my posts on X, I guess, and went in and edited the page after, confronting the other editors and saying, this is nonsense. How can you talk about something and not even acknowledge that the source exists now in English? And so this person went in and edited the page, and now in selected writings, 2 of our books are mentioned. That's it, but that's something. So we were very pleased to see that after all this effort, finally something had come of it.
Well, so we've gone through the book, we've gone through the Wikipedia. So now, let's get the other 2 books taken care of. This is the question I asked you last time, and I want to start with it because I think it helps people frame where Camus is coming from and what he's trying to describe. What is the disaster that he's the enemy of?
Well, he uses, I got this name from, he speaks of the people who are facilitating or at least permitting mass migration into Europe as the friends of the disaster. And so that's a term that comes up a number of times in the text that we translated. And I suppose I cleverly thought that enemy of the disaster would be a good title for him. But yeah, the disaster is the consequences of mass migration in Europe, be they social or political or religious in some sense. So that's the origin of the term.
So is the disaster something civilizational? Is it oriented to France, or is it Western in general?
Yeah, you can speak of it as being civilizational, right? I mean, obviously Camus is concerned principally with France, but he's also concerned with the West. He's very much an Anglophile. He thinks that what's happened, say, in London, London's massive demographic shifts over the last 50 years, that strikes him not just as something unfortunate or even appalling, but as criminal. He speaks of this stuff as a crime against humanity, these vast demographic shifts that are in some ways facilitated, some ways just permitted, some ways wanted or desired. So he uses the language of criminality to speak about this, and not just in the French case.
Right. Mm-hmm. All right, Andrew, I know you had some specific questions. Then I think we should get into the forward a little bit. So maybe you have some questions on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, especially digging into, the distinction. I mean, maybe just explain for everyone. I mean, most people listening to this, watching this, have some idea about how this term is used, in the media and everywhere else, and how it's picked up by like fringe elements. Talking about George Soros and the World Economic Forum or whatever are trying to replace everybody, which may or may not be true. Like that's it's really neither here nor there with reference to Camus. But so like distinguishing that, right, that perception of what the GR is versus what Camus thought actually was. So I guess first describe its popular understanding that you're fighting against. I mean, we've covered that a little bit, but I think maybe just focusing on that and then launching into why what he says is not that at all.
Yeah, I mean, Ethan, you did a good job, defining what the popular understanding is, and yeah, it's the idea that there's this sort of, this elite group of people, sort of rubbing their hands, smoking cigars in a room somewhere, orchestrating very intentionally this replacement of white populations in Europe, in the Americas. Often this is imagined as a Jewish conspiracy theory. So that unfortunately is what we're dealing with. But really what the Great Replacement, Camus uses the term acronym, and that means just a word describing a time or an era, chronos, name. So just as you had a great plague in 1348 or a Great Depression in 1929, now beginning in the 1970s, we've entered the era called the Great Replacement, which is in many respects, he's an old like Mitterrand era socialist. So he sees it very much as a ruse of capitalism. If you can detach people from their nation, their traditions, their religion, whatever it is that roots them, there's nothing left of an identity except the consumer. So mass migration facilitates that, but it's part and parcel. The critique of migration is part of a much larger critique, and we were talking about this earlier, CJ, of global replacism. This tendency, or it's not intentional. It's a machination, to use
He also calls it a tropism.
A tropism, like a kind of a bulging out, I guess.
Just a movement.
In other words, it's like explicitly not a conspiracy. It's describing something that, organic is probably, not quite, it's probably more nefarious than organic would describe, but it's sort of the natural unfolding of things that have been in play for over a century, and we're sort of living it out. And that's what it is.
Well, even going back to the Industrial Revolution, where the idea that you could create procedures that were repetitive, and so you would have a more efficient product, right? And it was only a matter of time before that idea was applied to human beings. Human beings can also be replaceable, and that will help facilitate productivity and profit and that sort of thing.
So this is just like a subset of replacism in general, calls it, right?
Right. He would say that the Great Replacement is a demographic phenomenon, is the most obvious instance or example of replacism, global replacism at work. But it is just that, right? It's an example, not the thing itself.
If you don't mind,
sure.
On that subject, on the back of our first book, Enemy of Disaster, in place of a description of the contents, we offer Camus' own very brief but I think forceful characterization of replacism. I can read that if you like.
Yeah.
A specter is haunting Europe and the world. It is replacism, the tendency to replace everything with its normalized, standardized, interchangeable double. The original by its copy, the authentic by its imitation, the true by the false, mothers by surrogate mothers, culture by leisure activities and entertainment, knowledge by diplomas, the countryside and city by the universal suburb, the native by the non-native, Europe by Africa, men by women, men and women by robots, people by other peoples, humanity by savage, undifferentiated, standardized, infinitely interchangeable post-humanity.
I love that quote. I think I mentioned this last time, but his his pacing, like he's just a good writer. It's a really tugging. One of you read a passage last time that I really, I think I emailed you about it later, but I was really moved by his writing, and I think a lot of us can connect with that. Like, I mean, for instance, if I could just explain, like, so that the whole thing with the Haitians in Springfield, one of the narratives that came out of that was that, Americans are lazy, they're obese, they don't want to work anymore. And so it's good that the Haitians are here doing their jobs for them. And like, when you connect that argument to racism, the argument is never Americans are lazy or obese. We need to invest in them and help them improve because there are people they need investment. They need someone to put back into them so that we can become better Americans again. The answer is always they're like widgets, right? They're out with the old and new. They can't work anymore. Why would we care about them? We can just to the dump and get new upgraded models. Like it's that same mentality.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It used to be that you would own a coat, and if it got torn or something, you would go get it fixed because you didn't have a lot of clothes, and there would be a tailor who would do that kind of thing for you. But now you just throw it away and you get another one. It's the same with this, the same sort of logic that replaces logic. I guess we could put some resources into helping the natives become more productive, but why do that when we just have some other people we can bring in? So,
and in public discourse, this is reflected specifically in this case by this totally. I mean, if you think about it, people are just inured to this now, but this totally bizarre talk of, for example, GDP or the labor market as if they are in a way that anthropomorphizes them. But the labor market really needs people. There are businesses that can't hire people without saying at the wages, the slave labor wages that we're offering, right? Or how else are we going to grow the GDP without acknowledging that GDP is a totally useless measure if it has no connection whatsoever to the quality of life of the people who are already living in a place. And so no, I entirely agree. I think that case is a perfect illustration of racism in action.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so I mean, everyone has heard the phrase, the one that we're not supposed to say, the great replacement. But what was the little replacement that set up conditions for a great one?
Right. Well, you said it. It is the necessary condition for a great replacement, and really what it is, it's the evacuation of a people's cultural memory. Camus says, he writes it over and over again, a people that knows its classics doesn't allow itself to be replaced. And again, here we're not dealing with some sort of conspiracy or overt plot to de-educate people. It's an outgrowth of egalitarianism and the application of what he calls hyper-democratic principles, which basically means the application of democratic principles to places where they don't belong, like the school or the family, right? So you want egalitarian outcomes in a school setting, right? Well, acquiring culture and mastering it is very hard, and only a few people are going to be able to really do that competently. But that's not an acceptable outcome in our world because everybody has to reach a certain level, et cetera. So the inevitable result is that you have to dumb down the expectations. There was an article in The Atlantic just maybe last week about, students at elite colleges who they were never obliged to read even a single book in high school. They read excerpts, things like that. But I mean, we have students not just graduating and going to like where I teach at a regional university in the Midwest, but going to elite schools on the East Coast who were not obliged to read a book. So again, that's another example of this kind of thing at work. But what it does, if you evacuate a people's memory of itself, of course they're replaceable in a demographic or ethnic sense because they don't know who they are and they don't know what they have to defend, what they owe to their ancestors, what they owe to themselves. So that prepares the way in just that way for the big show, as it were.
Yeah, I like that idea of because when you ask questions of who are we? I mean, that's a question that, some of us who are, trying to engage in politics at a deeper level are trying to figure out, is there a definition of an American? These are very difficult things that we should be, groping with and trying to figure out, what does it mean to be part of a nation? Who are we? And when we say we have a shared memory or a shared experience, what does that mean? That's sort of that type of thinking is very much a threat to the mentality that wants to deracinate everybody and separate them from their own history, sever them from their roots.
Yeah.
That's sort of a counter-revolutionary mentality to ask the question, who are we?
Yeah. And, go ahead, Ethan. Sorry.
Camus has just very quick. He has this thing, I know it from memory now, but this one quote from Enemy of Disaster, he repeats on a couple of occasions. He says, essentially, a people who knows its classics will never let itself be led to the dustbins of history. Mm-hmm. So there's this, he draws a very straight line between culture and the acquisition of culture and the continued existence of discrete, historically constituted peoples.
Yeah.
So that's, just to illustrate Louis's remark with regards to the connection between the little replace, between the great deculturation, actually, is his expression for it, and the great replacement. That's where it resides. So this erasure of identity, essentially.
Yeah.
What you were saying, CJ, was interesting. I was just thinking that, in France, there was an attempt at a discussion of, what is national identity back when Sarkozy was president. So this was like 2008, something like that. And of course, the people, primarily on the left, they reacted in horror. And the idea seemed to be that, well, there's no such thing. And in fact, there never was. Not only is there no French people, there never was one. Right? It's this really, and Camus, I forget where Camus talks about this. And maybe it's something you posted, Ethan, today or yesterday. He says, even Hitler going after the Jews, he never denied that the Jews existed as a people. Right? This is something that's even more
the retroactive,
racist, I guess. Yeah, retroactive.
That is crazy. I've noticed that too. Like there never was an American like that. I mean, that's something that we get now.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the 90s, we didn't.
You see that in England too, right? I mean, even on like popular level, like Netflix series where they'll do Pride and Prejudice and it will be like Africans there in the 1700s or whatever. And the purpose of that isn't, I saw this even with the movie like 1917, where they had, Indian and African troops mixed in with British troops in the trenches. And it's like, that's every detail down to the uniforms and everything else is precisely accurate. No anachronisms anywhere in that film. But then you have these integrated units, which is totally anachronistic. And you ask, well, why would they do that? Because they want to cement the idea that England has always been a nation of immigrants, just like they say that about the United States. That and France the same way. Well, Charlemagne or any of the history, Charles Martel or any of the history of France. That's all. You have that, but they never really were native to these places.
And I just saw a couple of weeks ago. It's not just, obviously it's an international phenomenon. It's the United States, it's Great Britain, it's France. But just a few weeks ago, I saw something to the effect that in Sweden, there was like some series on, I think it was on the Vikings. And suddenly half the Vikings were sub-Saharan Africans. And it's like, why,
they're not talking about the football team here in Minnesota.
No, well, yes, that would be different. But the falsehood is so transparent. The lie is so obvious. It's kind of astonishing that anyone even goes to the trouble to tell it. Interesting in its own right. That's a separate subject. But like, what is the point of propaganda that's so transparently false and untrue?
Yeah.
I have my own ideas, but that's as I said, another topic perhaps.
Well, I wonder if it's related to like the spirit of the great deculturization, because you can convince people to give up on yourself as a people if you actually have no belonging to the history that made you, right? So
I think I think it has kind of a demoralizing effect. I think we all like to feel like there's a certain story about who we are, right? And we want to see people who embody that in a physical way. That's just part of being an embodied being. And so when that gets disrupted or meddled with, it is sort of, you feel that something's being taken away from you. And
that was essentially my theory, is that I think the point of this is humiliation. The point is to rub it in people's faces. Like, you're no longer allowed to claim an us. Your us is over. This is the new us. And even though it's bogus, even though it's completely incredible and unbelievable, nevertheless, you don't dare challenge it. because if you do, you know the consequences.
Yeah.
It's putting the public in its place with respect to the newly regnant ideology.
Yeah. All right. So, we talked about the Great Replacement, and it's not a conspiracy, and it's actually coming from something. Does he ever get into, like, how long this has been around? This mentality, is this like an Industrial Revolution mentality? Is it French Revolution? Like, where does it come from?
Well, I don't know how much he gets into the Industrial Revolution. I read his 900-page recent book, La Dépossession, Depossession, that really theorizes global replacism more than he ever has before. So he does mention the Industrial Revolution, but his focus is really on the early 20th century and on Frederick Taylor, Taylorism, the principles of scientific management,
right,
and on Henry Ford as the in a way the embodiment of
the Marx
efficiency is the only thing that is important.
The Marx to Taylor's Lenin, he says.
Yeah. So it's a 20th century phenomenon. In the jump from the replaceability of objects, which is like the Fordian dream. You can just mass produce. One breaks down, you make another. You make another. You make another. When exactly that jumps from machines to human beings, that's an interesting question. I don't know if he ever sets that down. I mean, of course, it would be something gradual, right?
He says that Taylor himself made that move. Taylor was talking about scientific management, but he says, look, the principles that I'm laying out here are not to be understood as exclusively applying to the industrial workplace.
Mm-hmm.
They actually are of perfectly general application across human society and political life, and he makes that explicit. So the shift from specifically economic and industrial conception of replacism, though that's not Taylor's word, to a broader human conception thereof was already not just implicit but explicit in his work.
Yeah. Do you guys have? I don't know if you're gonna know what I'm talking about, but do you have that quote? There was that quote where he just describes each thing that was being replaced. Maybe you just read it. Maybe it was an excerpt from that. But like, there was the one that I had you send to me by email a couple months ago. But basically, he was just describing this whole phenomenon in a way that kind of contextualized things like the Great Replacement that we talk about demographically. And I was just so compelled by his ability to pinpoint the specific things our entire world, and we see this even today, like, old Western Europe Western civilization was basically replaced by Americanization, right? That's probably one theme in his. But even the things that I grew up with, like I grew up learning about the tall tales of like Johnny Appleseed and John Henry and Paul Bunyan. Like, that was my world, that was my America. None of those things are taught about anymore. And so, like, there's just been this complete liquidation of American culture, even as it was in the 90s. That's really creepy. If you are only looking back 20 years, people are asking themselves, where did my world go? My childhood home has been razed, and now there's a bunch of like suburban stucco houses there, and nobody knows anybody. Like, that's all part of this general mainstream river of things that the Great Replacement is only this capstone on.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, you asked about the origins of replacism, and Louis indicated that they were to be found, according to Camus, in the work of Taylor, and that's true. But there's another crucial inflection point historically in Camus' writing, and that is the 1970s. That's when you get replacism as, if you like, this kind of economic phenomenon in discourse, joining forces with anti-racism. And that's what confers this terrible power upon it. And that's what the passage that I sent to you last time addresses. And I have it here. I don't know if you want to hear it again. Or...
Yeah, let's do it. I love it.
Okay. It's a long one, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So now he's describing essentially the various parties to mass migration in Europe. For like the triangular trade before it, the present-day colonization of Europe has 3 protagonists, not 2. There are those who do it, or are it, the immigrants, the migrants, the refugees, the conquerors, the colonists, the occupier. There are those who are subjected to it, willingly or no, the natives and assimilated, the autochtones, the colonized, the subjected, the conquered, the occupied. And there are those who want it or propel it, who drive it forward without even having to want it, via the operation of mere mechanical, legal, verbal, accounting, and financial linkages. Political staffers, journalists, judges, the worlds of finance, employers, the European Union in its present form, the IMF, the UN, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Amazon, and so on. In the great replacement now underway, there are the replacers, the replacees, and the replacists. And the replacists are themselves the unlikely combination of 2 forces that one would have thought as remote from one another as possible, whose foot soldiers do not always even know that they are allied, but whose interests are in fact highly complementary and convergent, to such a point that the cordial relations between them, what one might call their objective alliance, to use the vocabulary of another era, have up till now rendered them invincible, all-powerful. I am here, of course, referring to profit and the search for profit, on the one hand, the purely managerial conception of the world and the management of the human park, economism, financialization, Davos, and Davocracy, this administration of the world by great financiers, banks, multinationals, robots, business, big tech, and on the other, anti-racism, or more specifically, the second anti-racism, the one that is no longer like the first, the necessary and eminently moral protection of a few threatened races, but the hatred of all, the pseudo-scientific negation of their existence, and the desire to eradicate them, to suppress all differences between them, to merge them, and not just races, but now also sexes. And while it is at it, nations, cultures, civilizations, all that separates and distinguishes, all that lends itself to discrimination, all that harms the production of the new man, of Nutella man, of serene humanity, of undifferentiated human material, infinitely exchangeable, spreadable at will, a paste without lumps or clots, pressed by the press and ground down by the courts, liquefied, ready-made for every shanty of the global shantytown, this shanty universe wherein reigns the copy, the reproduction, the imitation, the ersatz, the low cost, the fake, the inverted real, the faux sell, mass negationism, where what is happening is not happening.
I love that passage so much. It's like Andrew wrote this book, and he refers often to Trash World, and it's very punchy. But I think Camus has you beat, like, just in the eloquence of that.
I can't claim to be as good as a great French author.
Anyways, like the part where he just gets to as humans, we're merged, and finally we're into a paste that's spreadable. Yeah. And it's just like, you see it everywhere you go now. Yeah. Like, for instance, I just moved from California to Tennessee. And one of the great things about America was its regional differences and how vastly different the culture is. And it's still there. Obviously, there's still regional differences. But you see these same international corporations with these same products kind of squeezing out the old regional stores and, storefronts and products and all that stuff until we're one big mass of a non-culture, of an anti-culture. And they want that mentality to spread around all of the Western world and into Latin America and so on. And that's just the mentality. And it's just, it's devastating to see. And I left California because, it was no longer my California. And the same movement that was there, as I see it in places here. And it's just, it's devastating. And if you have that constantly, you have no will to live and to defend your culture and your way of life.
And I agree. I've noticed the same thing this past week, once again, with regards to the hurricane. Not as far as things are happening on the ground here, but in the manner in which the population that's been affected is characterized. On the one hand, you have the popular cultural characterization of the Appalachian hillbilly, hick, redneck, this ignorant Southern, probably religious fanatic and so forth, living in a trailer park somewhere. They've been otherized, as it were. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you have this kind of, on the right, this romantic representation of the same people. These are the real Americans. They're the descendants of Albion's seed, right? the last remnant of the original, native population of European Americans to have yet been, that has yet to be submerged under like the forces of migration and cultural homogenization. Well, both of these representations are false. The people who have been affected by the hurricane, not only is it a heterogeneous population with many differences within it, but in addition to which, they're just watching the same Netflix shows that everyone else is. They're going to Starbucks just like you are. I mean, there are obviously pockets of difference, but those are disappearing very quickly.
Right. No, I agree.
So it's interesting that there's this like attachment to this kind of this regional cultural representation that itself is just like it's an artifact of times that are now behind us rather.
Well, it was like that with the Olympics too. I think you were talking about that, Ethan, that, you have these, putative nations who are competing against each other, but, America, draws from every nation. Europe is drawing from every nation. I mean, a lot from Africa. And so you only have a few nations that are constituted really as a people in that competition in a way that makes it interesting. Right? I found myself rooting for Jamaica, for example, because that's like that's a people, right, with a particular past. But to see America win, well, what exactly does that mean? It's I know you were talking about that, Ethan, I think with Matt Crawford, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And and this is not new. The first time I noticed this was in France way back in 1998 with the World Cup. I was there for the '98 World Cup. And the French team for the first time was I think maybe majority, anyhow, half the team were immigrants or immigrant descended people. And so when France won the World Cup, the political establishment said, "See, diversity is our strength. This is why we need more immigration." And they began to promote and bring in more and more people, as just as a matter of policy. But the question that arose for me, anyhow, at the time was, but when the team becomes less and less French, to what extent is the victory, a specifically French victory? And since then, of course, this has become a perfectly general phenomenon. Every national sports team in Europe or in North America has this. Almost everyone has this aspect. And so, yeah, it raises questions of identity. It also raises questions of allegiance. Perhaps I'm just astonished that most people don't feel that way. That people continue to get excited about these events. Who cares? It's like Team Pepsi versus Team Coke. I mean, you have these corporate sponsors. They put their players on the field. They trade them like gladiators from city to city or state to state or nation to nation. What difference does it make whether I don't know, Team Verizon beats Team Starbucks or T-Mobile or whatever. I mean, because that's just what it is.
Yeah, are either of you familiar with Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy at all? Have either of you read?
No, I'm not. No.
He was German and then immigrated to America. Scholar, sociologist, I believe, was his particular field. But he wrote in like the 50s about the future and some of these things where the new tribalism that will begin to exist will be. I mean, he didn't use this language, but we can today. Would be over like brands where it's like I'm a Pepsi. I'm on Tribe Pepsi or Coke or whatever. I mean, you can see this almost in like online with like fandoms, right? You go to the subreddit of like Marvel or whatever, or Star Wars, and like that's your entire life is that thing. And people are organized along those lines, and you see that. I mean, I think he maybe had some insight and some prescience in terms of understanding the little replacement of culture, where culture is completely eradicated, and this is all you have left in terms of identity. Is well, you can have these consumer identities, right? You're allowed to have that, but nothing, nothing real, nothing tangible, nothing your ancestors would have recognized whatsoever. And so I mean, you see that. I mean, I think about this in terms of like I grew up, here in Minnesota. I'm still in Minnesota, so we'll get to the super chats at the end here, but we have a super chat who wants to get together with us in Tennessee. I'm not there yet. CJ is, but in Minnesota, growing up, I mean, I remember when the Somalis first came here when I was in junior high school, and we started getting Somali kids, and thinking about that, and we had several refugee resettlements. We had some kids from Bosnia come to our school, things like this. Is rural Minnesota. I wasn't in the Twin Cities, and we're just told, well, these kids come from another country, and there's a war there, and they're suffering, and we're taking care of them because we're good people, and that's what we do. And over time, by the time you're in high school and college, you see this massive influx of Somalis, and I began thinking, and I wasn't super. I mean, I was conservative. You listen to Rush Limbaugh with my dad in the truck or whatever, but I wasn't like this wing ideologue, nativist or something. And thinking these people are never going to like become American like us, or if they did, it would take 10 generations to get to that point. And yet, by the time I was in college, I saw them begin to adopt some of these consumer identities, right? They would cheer for the same sports teams that we did, and they would listen to the same rap music or whatever. Like they would adopt those things, but they didn't have the deep cultural roots of America. They retained all of those things together with their people, and they still retain them. And so I guess it makes me wonder with Camus and the things that he is describing, and people being viewed as interchangeable and just like machines, that, I mean, obviously that doesn't work, right? Obviously you can't make different people into Americans in the way we would maybe understand it in a historical sense. And so what comes of all of this, right? If you bring in 100 million people from the third world into America, give them temporary protected status or whatever, legal machinations you need, and deposit them here, right? Like what happens to America or to France or to Great Britain or Germany or any of the other Western countries, right? I mean, 50 or 100 years down the road, what does this look like?
Well, and it might be okay for a while if the economy is good and there are enough products and enough things to have a kind of soporific effect on people. But the minute that drops away, the minute that there's an economic crisis or anything like that, the deeper parts of people are going to start to emerge. And Camus talks about this is, in the essay, The Second Career of Adolf Hitler, he says, it's all well and good if your people have decided that everybody's interchangeable and we're beyond this sort of idea of the nation or the tribe and all of that. But if other people, if the rest of the world hasn't made that decision with you, you're in trouble. Right? Because they're going to remember who they are. Much better than you remember who you were. He uses the past tense. And that is
that's so powerful, and that is so true. That's one of the things that I've noticed. Everyone's noticed is like, all these people coming in, they stick together, and they keep their ways. And Americans are the only ones that insist that we have no ways. And it's just like, well, if we are nobody, and all these other tribes are somebody, who's gonna win the long game on that one?
Well, it's obvious, right? Yeah. Well, the idea that Americans are nobody is also ridiculous too. I mean, the institutions that subtend our nation are very clearly derived from, the conflicts between English Protestants going back to the 17th century. I mean, it's very particular. So, but then again, that's if you're not educating people about that,
and that's not even like that's not even some like conspiracy thing. Like this was like Sam Huntington's thesis. This is very basic mainstream stuff.
Yeah, we have a thing called private property. That's not just like a platonic form that descends from the sky upon all peoples. It's unique.
Well, hey, my family's here. I have to take some kids to activities, so I actually do have to bow out. Andrew, I don't know if you're going to keep going, but
well, yeah, I could too, but I do have to get going too. But we should wrap up. Even though I could talk for 3 or 4 more hours about this.
Where can people find the books? Because that's at the end of the day, like this is about getting Camus' thought out there, and that's what we wanted to have you guys help us with.
Yeah, we appreciate that. All of our books are available globally, actually, on Amazon. So if you just put in Renaud Camus, in the search bar, you'll find our books. They can also be purchased direct from our distributor, Itasca, and some bookstores will carry them as well. So they're pretty widely available.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Everyone should look it up. Andrew, do you have any last words, or are we good?
No, I think that's all we got for today. Thank you, Louis, and thank you, Ethan, for joining us. And yeah, we'd like to have you back at some point to
Yeah.
continue this discussion.
And I know to avoid the Middleton Public Library now. So, and mercifully, the dog has been quiet. I'm kind of surprised. So it went over well.
Yeah, my children were not, so that's why I got off screen a few times. But thank you, gentlemen, so much, and thank you all for listening. We did have a super chat. I should read that because that's what they're paying for. So from Jay Forte, love the show, gentlemen. Welcome to my state, at least for CJ so far. We'll need to get lunch sometime once you all are settled, or y'all. I need to get acclimated to that regionally specific dialect. Once y'all are settled. And so, yeah, just Jay Forte, DM me or CJ in a couple weeks, and we'd love to do it. But thank you for your super chat, and to everyone out there in the comments, thank you all so much. Thank you for watching the show, supporting the show, liking and subscribing and sharing it. Please share this one. This one is especially important. I think if you care about the stuff that I've written about, Trash World, things like that, this will take it to another level. So thank you all again. Remember to stay peacefully dangerous, and we will see you all next time.